Hi, welcome back to another live stream with the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. The Global Network was created in 1992 to prevent the arms race from moving into space. You can support the show by clicking on the like button and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Also, check out our website at spaceforpeace.org. My guest this time is Margaret Flowers, the Director of Popular Resistance and host of Clearing the Fog. She serves on the Administrative Committee of UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition, and on the Executive Committee of the U.S. Peace Council. We thank Global Network board member Will Griffin for doing all the tech work to make this show possible. So, Margaret, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Bruce.
Great to have you on.
Thanks.
The peace movement across the West is divided these days, on some level anyway, over the war in Ukraine. Could you talk about how you feel about this current situation, and in particular, the role of the U.S. government and the corporate media in creating this division in the West?
No, thank you for that question. And it's really, of course, it's something that it serves the interest of the power structure to have the peace movement divided on this, so that we can't unify in our opposition. Although there is a lot of work being done for folks to find points of unity so they can unify and do actions. But there's been a concerted campaign in the United States for some time now to demonize Russia. Make false allegations against Russia. The whole Russiagate, even more recently, claims again of Russia is going to interfere in our elections this year. All of this has been designed to demonize Russia in the eyes of people in the United States so that there is less opposition to the US's and the US allies' aggression towards Russia. And so, the conflict in Ukraine is such an obvious example of this, where you hear US government officials talking about how we're defending their democracy. Well, how do you have a democracy in a country where the United States in 2014 openly conducted a coup, which, Ray McGovern just wrote about, that the fact that 18 days before the coup happened, it was leaked that it was going to happen through a conversation that Victoria Nuland had, a U.S. official over there, who basically admitted who the U.S. puppet was going to be installed in Ukraine. So, Ukraine is not a democracy, and this is being, portrayed as something that needs to be done to free the Ukrainians. The reality is, as you well know, Bruce, because I know you've been there, is, the coup government and subsequent governments of Ukraine and the military, which has been increasingly taken over by, Nazis in Ukraine, have been conducting a war against the people, the Russian ethnic people in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine, for the past 8 years, killing, I've seen, estimates of 14,000 people there. And so what we're seeing in the media in the US is this, Russia is this bad. They've come in, they've just, unprovoked attack against Ukraine. Nothing could be farther from the truth. This was 8 years or more in the making. Definitely, actually longer than that, the U.S. has been interfering there, to create a situation where Russia, basically had been saying for some time, we have these red lines that, you can't cross. And the U.S. and NATO and Western allies continued to push those lines and, supporting, training the military in Ukraine who was murdering ethnic Russians. There comes a point where, this had to happen, but there's so much division in the United States over, was this provoked? Was this not provoked? Is Russia, bad? Are they imperialist? So yeah, I'll stop there. Oh, I can't hear you, Bruce. You're muted.
Good answer. I just wanted to add one thing. When you talk about 14,000 Russian ethnics have been killed by the Kiev U.S.-backed government. There's also 34,000 or more have been wounded. And in fact, just this week, the Kiev government with U.S. NATO supplied weapons have been shelling the cities of Donetsk, killing lots of civilians at the local market and things like that, clearly not military targets. So it's a really sad story.
Right. And just quickly, Eva Keen Bartlett has been doing really excellent work to document those murders in the Donetsk region. And I was going to say something else, but now it just went out of my head. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I'll ask you another question.
Okay.
I know on your website at Popular Resistance, you often report on the suppression of dissent. Could you share your thinking on this reality and how it fits into this current situation with Ukraine?
Right. So there was a report, some years ago on the kind of the state of war in the United States. And one of the things that the Pentagon was complaining about was the loss of the narrative, control of the narrative. And that's necessary. If you want to be able to conduct these conflicts, then you have to be able to control the narrative to suppress people, seeing any reasons to be in opposition to it, and to be able to provide them with the misinformation that supports the war. There has been a lot of great work by independent media and then international outlets to expose the truth of what's going on in Russia. And what we see in the United States is just a lack of tolerance for that. I mean, early on, shutting down the Russia Today network was a huge one. That meant, that truth tellers like Chris Hedges, who had his weekly program on Contact, Lee Camp, who had Redacted Tonight, who used political comedy to educate people, those were shut down. We see social media filtering what folks can say and censoring folks, shutting down their accounts if they, give a narrative that's not consistent with the kind of U.S., propaganda, corporate, military, industrial, back to media narrative. And so, it's amazing to me that at this point, people don't recognize, after we've been so obviously lied into so many conflicts, that you well-intentioned, intelligent people in the United States are believing that same media when it provides stories about what's happening in Ukraine. And there are some great folks out there, like I mentioned, Eva Bartlett, who's there documenting it, but also Moon of Alabama. That website provides great information about what's actually happening and correcting the narrative that you see in the United States. But, there's others. Folks like Scott Ritter has been doing great work here in the U.S. to educate people about what's going on there. But these voices are not heard in the mainstream.
Exactly. The public across Europe are beginning to react with large protests against the U.S. and EU sanctions and the war aimed at Russia. They're seeing how it's impacting their lives dramatically. What's your thinking about the sanctions?
Well, and disclosure, I'm part of the Sanctions Kill Coalition in the United States, which we've been working to educate people about the use of economic warfare in what we call sanctions. But technically, what the United States and its Western allies are imposing on these countries are called unilateral coercive measures. They're not measures that are decided upon in an international body, where there's a deliberation and then, this is there's been this transgression, we need to impose these sanctions. It's just the U.S. unilaterally saying, no, we're going to impose this upon you. They haven't worked for decades now. The U.S. continues to use them, and in particular, the sanctions against Russia, they don't have widespread support. There was just an excellent piece, showing that almost 90% of the world is not participating, is not enforcing the sanctions on Russia. The sanctions are hurting people in the United States and in the European Union in terms of raising fuel and food prices. Businesses are shutting down because they can't get the inputs they need. to continue to run their businesses, in particular, energy supplies, gas. So all of this is hurting people in the West, but it's also hurting people in the global South as well. Facing these high fuel prices and these high food prices and lowered perhaps production of food as a result. So it's amazing that the United States continues to use them when there's so much evidence that they backfire. But in this situation, they're not really hurting the Russian economy. What they're doing is they're driving de-dollarization, that and other things that are happening that more and more countries are just recognizing that it's not safe to operate in the dollar. Look at what happened to the Central Bank of Afghanistan, where the U.S. has basically blocked $9 billion from them. And so more and more countries are starting to do their trade in other denominations. And again, that's going to be a situation that ends up hurting folks in the West.
Another excellent answer. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Overall, it appears that the war in Ukraine is actually a U.S.-NATO war, using Ukraine as a tool to force regime change in Moscow. And the U.S. NATO also talk about taking on China. This is really interesting because here, after 20 years of U.S. NATO brutal occupation of Afghanistan, they limped out of there. They couldn't beat the Taliban. And now they're talking about taking on the two nuclear powers, Russia and China, at the same time. I mean, it just really is absolutely insane. So what do you think the real agenda of the U.S. NATO is at this time?
Right. Yeah. And just to underscore how ridiculous it is, the Pentagon knows that they can't win a major conflict with these countries. The United States does not have the resources it would need. It would have to bring them from outside. And China controls some of those resources. So the U.S. couldn't even, successfully wage this conflict. This is all part of the reality that the United States is losing its control of the world, is no longer the dominant force in the world. And there's a new kind of multipolar world order that's rising up. And the United States is in denial of this and believes that it can, bully and be aggressive and do whatever it can to continue to hang on to that control. Again, this is something the Pentagon is aware of. They issued something called the post-primacy report, recognizing this situation. And what they concluded from that report was that they needed to spend more more money on the Pentagon, develop more weapons, develop more intelligence networks, and, basically double down on what the United States has been doing forever to try to maintain this control. But as experts, Alfred McCoy is one of them, talk about, the U.S.'s ability to maintain this control is dying. It is sunsetting. It's obvious in Afghanistan and in other conflicts that the United States has been involved in or provoked, where the U.S. is not seeing the outcomes that it was hoping to see. And we're just going to see kind of this series, what he predicts, of these kind of acts of aggression, then failing, and just kind of that continuing until the empire finally, recognizes that it can't continue on this path. But in the course of that, so many people around the world are going to be impacted in a negative way because the U.S. is just kind of, refusing to cooperate and change tacks.
Do you think that the upcoming elections in November and then the elections in 2024 for president are really going to change this current situation very much?
No, I mean, we have a bipartisan war machine. I mean, we have a war economy in the United States, right? The military-industrial complex is permeated throughout the country, and it needs conflict in order to continue to profit. I see this with my older children and their generation of friends, and how hard it is for folks who are coming out of college, with degrees in the sciences. They're looking around for jobs, and the jobs are basically in the military industrial complex. So we have a bipartisan machine in Congress that every year, almost unanimously votes more and more money. So no, I don't think that, no matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats in power in the White House, the foreign policy stays largely the same.
So, what do you think the neocons who basically run things in Washington, what do you think they're going to do as they begin to increasingly lose control, economic control, political control, military control around the world? It feels like they're getting really desperate right now, and they're getting increasingly dangerous. What's your sense of what's going to come next?
Yeah, I would say, it's definitely a frightening time, and there are other folks more knowledgeable than I am who are, saying the same thing. I mean, we just saw, President Biden basically accusing Russia of, they're going to use nuclear weapons. Russia's not saying that they want to use nuclear weapons at all. And in fact, as Evo Morales just reminded us, it's the United States that has used, atomic weapons and is, currently redoing the nuclear arsenal so that we can have more usable nuclear weapons. I think that what we've seen is that I don't know, will cooler heads prevail? I don't know. I don't know that we can actually count on that in this situation, because I think there's probably some division within probably within the Pentagon with the White House. We do see kind of Biden saying things and then folks trying to pull that back a little bit. But how far is the U.S. willing to go to try to hang on to that power? Power, which means that the United States has for such a long time controlled resources around the world, and that has economically benefited, people here, but also the major transnational corporations. I don't see any kind of common sense coming from that. And so I think we do need to be worried, about what the future is. I think folks are saying we're extremely close to the risk of a nuclear war.
So your work at Popular Resistance and with UNAC and U.S. Peace Council, what do you feel is the best strategy at this time for us in the peace movement collectively as we try to deal with this really dangerous situation that we're living in at this moment?
Yeah, I think that some of the work that's being done is really critical, like the education to cut through this narrative, this false narrative about what's happening there. So anyone can look at the alternative sources and find out more information about what's happening there, or at least question the narrative that's being given in the corporate media. And so talking to people in your communities, in your family, organizing educational events to let people know that we're being lied into this conflict, that it's an extremely dangerous one, is something that everyone can do. But I think that we're going to need to be more organized and more mobilized. You talked about the mobilizations in Europe, and they're really impressive. I mean, I think the earliest ones I saw were coming out of Italy, where the union members were refusing to transport weapons to Ukraine, and they were shutting down ports and refusing to load the weapons. Now, as we see inflation hitting and folks are really struggling, major protests in Brussels and Germany, and other places throughout Europe, of folks saying no to NATO, no to the conflict, no to providing more weapons. We know weapons to Ukraine is just going to prolong the conflict. And now, we have information about what happened in April when they were, Russia and Ukraine were negotiating peace talks, and it was basically the U.S. and the United Kingdom that stepped in and prevented that. The U.S. wants this to continue. They want to continue to send weapons and to continue to provoke Russia, because I think the U.S. has this belief that they can actually destabilize Russia, which is, the end goal, right? To remove Putin from power and try to put in place a government that the United States can have more control over. So I think we're going to need to see those kinds of mobilizations here. I also am really inspired by mobilizations we see around the world. And I know World Beyond War here in the U.S. has been working with groups in Canada to really take on, the weapons industry, the military industrial complex directly and, protest them. There's excellent work happening in the United Kingdom right now with the Palestine Action shutting down the Israeli weapons manufacturer there, Elbit. Those kinds of actions are important. And we have a history of that in the U.S. During the U.S.-backed Contra war in Nicaragua to try to stop the Sandinista revolution, you had folks literally occupying train tracks to prevent weapons from being delivered to the Contras in Nicaragua. You have, during the Vietnam War, folks who went out in kayaks and boats and tried to block the naval ships from going to Vietnam. Those actions and major mobilizations in Washington, D.C., these are the kinds of things that we need to be doing. And especially, I think right now, as the United States is really failing on so many fronts to provide for the basic needs of the people, which is a primary role of the government. People can't afford health care. They have, their wages are low, despite the fact that productivity is high. The wealth income, gap is growing. Education is out of reach. Housing is out of reach. We need to be making that connection between the fact that the government can literally write a blank check for the Pentagon, giving more money to the Pentagon each year than they even ask for, yet cutting basic important programs and refusing to provide, that basic social structure to people in the U.S. That's a point where I think people can understand how this hits us at home. But also the other piece of that, and I think you touched on it earlier, was, with where is this going? Well, you try to suppress the dissent, but if people break through that, there could be other forms of actions to try to prevent people from challenging the military-industrial complex and surveillance, going after folks, legally. Those are things that we could see down the road.
Some people say that the ruling oligarchs, the U.S. neocons and the neocons that run much of Europe, these oligarchs really want to bring us all down. They want to destroy social progress. They want to accumulate as much capital as they can for themselves because they see this multipolar world being created, and they want to fight back against that. And one way to do that is by destroying the Western economies. How do you feel about that idea or that subject that some people are raising as what's really driving this Western political agenda these days?
Yeah, I don't know that it's like some big conspiracy to do this. I think, in my view, what we're seeing is the natural result of the systems that are in place globally. And when you have, these capitalist economies, and this, in the United States, this control over our political system by those who have the money, and they clearly have no regard for human life. Just look, for me, so much of my activism has been around healthcare, and how every year tens of thousands of people are dying just because they don't have health insurance. Where's the concern about that, right? We're concerned about the lives in Ukraine, but what about the people here who are dying because they can't afford to get the medical care that they need? There's no concern. I don't think the oligarchs have any concern for human life. It's really just about the money and where can we go next. And we see it in the way that kind of even the World Bank operates, that the World Bank actually provides corporations with information about countries that change their laws that would be more or less favorable to corporations, so they know where they can move their money. There's a free movement of money around the world. People are restricted, but the corporations can go wherever they want to go to profit, wherever the rules are the most lax, and they can exploit people and the planet the most. So I just think that this is kind of where the global system is. And of course, that cadre has to go after anybody that's providing a different example of the way things could be. So China, is a big one. They've eradicated poverty. That's not a very good example for the people in the West who are not doing that. Building new economies in places like Venezuela and Nicaragua, building, where they're building food sovereignty and clean energy and new ways of doing things that, that are empowering indigenous knowledge, these things that we need to be doing. I think the corporations are trying to suppress that. They don't want people to know that things can be different. And the outcome, either way is going to be the same, right? Millions of people suffering and dying for profits.
We know it's going to be tough for Europe this winter. Essentially, they're being deindustrialized because of their sanctions on Russia, and they're the ones that shut off Nord Stream 2, the pipeline, the new pipeline that was created to move natural gas from Russia into northern Germany and then spread out from there.
Yeah.
The U.S. was always against Nord Stream 2. They wanted to force Europe to buy fracked gas, LNG gas, on ships sent from the U.S. to Europe at a much higher cost.
Mm-hmm.
It's really worked for the U.S. In fact, I heard today that Volkswagen, because of the loss of energy in Germany, is going to move some of their plants to the United States. So it's really being hollowed out here. And so I really pity the people of Europe this winter. I know you commented briefly on some of the protests, but might you say a little more about what the people of Europe are really facing this winter?
Right. And people are, starting to predict what they call a winter of discontent as inflation is rising and energy prices. I mean, also, looking at the United Kingdom and the energy prices there, it's just, these are prices that no one would even think possible that these increases could be as high as they are. And folks are already starting to do things like, not cooking as much because of the energy costs. And so I guess eating out of the can. I mean, I think that folks are going to be hurting, as you said. Industries are moving. Industries are just basically not operating because they can't get the inputs that they need. So there's going to be an influx of people without jobs. All of this is going to cause people to rise up and fight back, as they're starting to do. It will be interesting to see what the response to that is. But you're absolutely right. This is, really about oil and gas. There's been a big push, because I think it was under the Obama administration that they, I think it was in 2015, that they allowed oil and gas exports from the United States. And so that's been resulting in this push to build these fracked gas terminals where they can liquefy it and then, as you said, put it on boats and send it over. The crazy thing is that right now the European Union doesn't even have the infrastructure to accept that, because then you have a refinery where you convert it back into gas and then you transport that out. So we've really, and they too have put themselves in this situation where, the reason they're hurting, it's all because of these decisions that have been made. It doesn't have to be this way.
I read recently that India is getting gas from Russia,
right,
processing it and then selling it back to Europe. And China is buying energy from Russia and selling it to the United States. So it's amazing, and that's not reported in the mainstream media in our country at all.
Right. And they're buying it in rubles, because that's what, after the U.S. started seizing money and imposing sanctions on Russia, of course, they're not going to want dollars anymore, because they can lose that. We can just withhold it.
All right. We have about less than a minute left. Do you want to just make a closing comment to the listeners?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I do want folks to check out popularresistance.org, because every day we try to provide sources, alternative sources, so that people can get a different viewpoint on what's happening. And you can sign up for the Daily Digest. It's free, and just every day you'll get an email that has a links, to all of the stories that have been posted. But this is a scary time, and I hope that folks will take action, do something in your community.
Thank you, Margaret. Really appreciate you coming on the show. And thanks for watching another edition of Space Alert. We'll do another show next month, interviewing some other peace movement leaders. Until then, good luck to you all, and please get organized.